I've been intrigued now for some time about the benefits of using expanding foam adhesive for fixing skirtings and architraves in place. And now I'm back in the kitchen with some pretty tricky skirtings to fix. I thought I'd put this stuff to the test. As usual, today's video will expose the downsides and the upsides of expanding foam adhesive, and might go some way to explaining why you don't see more videos using this stuff to fix skirtings and architraves. But why expanding foam? Well, whenever I install skirtings using the typical method of screwing them to the wall with some grab adhesive, I'm left with a nagging worry about what if I want to remove them in the future for whatever reason. I had no option in our bedroom where I used pine and found it warped catastrophically once I got it into the centrally heated house. But here in the kitchen, for the first time I'm using MDF, bought from a local timber merchant. And as you can see, it looks like pretty decent stuff. Bit of a strange sort of striation effect on the back, but that doesn't really matter. It's got a basic priming throughout, which hopefully will make my life a lot easier. And fundamentally, there is no sign of any warping at this point. Helped by the fact I've kept it flat on the garage floor, and this has made cutting the angles so much easier. A few months back before the kitchen went in, I fixed an initial run to the wall using the same Loctite screws I'd used previously, but thought there has to be a better way, and I was attracted to adhesive foam because you can simply slide a saw down the back if you ever want to remove it, which you can't do if you use one of these admittedly very good grab adhesives or even a glue gun. And by cutting down on fixings, you're reducing all that filling and sanding. And the kitchen, recently renovated with newly plastered walls and a pretty flat floor that I've just laid, there's a link to that on screen now, should be an ideal situation for expanding foam adhesive. Before we get to the gluing, I thought I'd talk you through a few processes I've used, and for that, here's a quick tool run through. There's my old trusty workbench and a tool you might have seen on my summer outdoor furniture build, my Skil 20-volt sliding bevel miter saw, connected to my Henry vacuum because I am, after all, working in the kitchen. Now, I've always prided myself on using manual tools, manual miter boxes, even mechanical miter boxes in the past. But I've got to say, if there's one tool you should be buying if you're taking on a skirting board and architrave challenge, it's a miter saw. Why? Because you just get a far superior cut, guaranteed every time, with one of these, as opposed to what you're going to get if you try and do this manually using a miter box. So have a bit of a hunt around because there are some pretty reasonably priced tools out there. Other tools I use, clamps, not as important as I thought they'd be. The expanding foam adhesive, obviously, which I'll come on to, drill driver, fine tooth saw and coping saw, contour gauge, combination square, tape measure and hammer. There's obviously others. I'll refer to the rest as I go, and there'll be a full list with links in the description below the video. Quick chat about internal corners before we get on to the adhesive. Now, I've done a full video on this, link on screen now, but suffice to say I like to scribe my internal corners rather than cut them at a 45 degree. But ironically, the first job is to cut a 45 degree angle, as this shows us what needs removing. The angle piece can then be cut off. I use the miter saw for the bulk of it, finishing off with a handsaw. This leaves a couple of straight cuts, which you can either do again with a miter saw or a fine tooth saw. And for this I love my Japanese shikunin saws. And then all we've got left is the curve, which you can remove using a coping saw. And the trick with a coping saw is to keep the saw moving so you can gradually turn through the curve. And in we go. Oh, do you know what? Considering I haven't even sanded that, I think that's the best joint I've ever done. But they don't always fit that well first time, and you sometimes need to make adjustments, which you can do with a power file if you have one, or I also use a wooden spoon wrapped in sandpaper. And a Stanley blade or chisel is also handy to make small adjustments. I just needed to trim the skirting before gluing it in place, and I'm setting the architrave 5 to 6 millimeters back from the door lining, and find it easier to cut the skirting and then butt the architrave up to it rather than trim the skirting to the right width with the architrave already fixed in place. So clearly on this job, I'm trying to get away from using screws or nails. But also when you hear people talking about using expanding foam, there's a lot of chat about whether you have to hold the skirting in position whilst the foam sets. As it happens, you don't have to, as you'll see in a minute. But right now for the first skirting, I was concerned I needed some way of fixing the skirting in place, as my sort of clamping options were a bit limited. But this was an internal stud wall I recently built. So I thought I'd show you a useful technique of locating stud work with a magnet. That way I could use screws to hold the skirting in place if I needed to, whilst the foam went off. The magnet finds the screws that fix the plasterboard to each stud, thereby locating exactly the position of the stud. Quick bit of prep to remove any high spots and we were ready. And what about the foam itself? Well, I tend to pick up whatever's available in the builders merchants that I'm in, but for that reason I've used a lot of this on this job. This was actually on the gun when I started, so that's what you'll see a lot of. I think Instastick is kind of the market leader in expanding foam adhesives, so I thought I'd better get a tin of that just to see how we got on with it. This is my old non-stick applicator gun. Very important to have a non-stick gun because basically you hardly ever have to clean it out, and you certainly don't have to take the tin of foam off until it's finished. So that's a new applicator gun I've bought because the old one, as I'll come on to in a minute, is getting a little bit knackered after all its years of use, although I've literally never cleaned it out. In terms of cleaning guns, get yourself a tin of this, not so much for cleaning the gun out for the reasons I've just mentioned, but because it's really useful to give the nozzle a quick spray after each application of the foam, just to keep that applicator gun clean. Before you apply the foam, it's important to moisten both surfaces to assist with curing and so that the emulsion doesn't pull all the moisture from the polyurethane foam. You'll see how important this is in a minute. Now, I was concerned not to overspray the foam, but this was in hindsight not the best application. The lines that I've done here are too thin, such that the skirting has actually come detached from the wall at this point, but I didn't want to overdo it in case it expanded out below and above the board. And I've been using these nozzles to try and protect the gun tip. As you can see, over the years, this gun tip has lost its non-stick coating. This wouldn't have happened with nozzles and regular spraying with the gun cleaner. Next, and we'll come on to why in a minute, it's important you leave the adhesive for 3 to 5 minutes before pressing it against the wall. You want it to be sort of stringy to the touch, ideally. So it was on with the skirting, lightly pinned in place with those lost tight screws. And then in the corner I used a quick clamp on the ruby suction cup I recently used to tile the kitchen floor, which is a pretty good way to clamp skirtings whilst they set in tricky areas. The grab strength on the foam was pretty impressive, although I definitely hadn't used enough. Next up, it was the architrave. I marked the miters like this, transposed those onto the architrave itself, and then cut it on the saw. And I resealed the bottom edge with Johnston's shellac based primer, which is equivalent to Zinsser bin. Perfect for jobs like this because it dries in a matter of minutes. On the adhesive front, I think I got the quantities about right this time, or maybe I applied a bit much as it did expand out the side here, but once it's gone off you can easily cut and scrape it away, something you cannot do with grab adhesive, so that's a big reason for using foam rather than adhesive. I used glazing packers to ensure the mitered corners lined up seamlessly, and yes, old habits die hard, I was still at this point using lost tight screws and a few clamps. And so we're on to the external corners, of which there are a few in this kitchen. These have generally been a breeze because the MDF has stayed so flat. I made 2 45-degree cuts on the miter saw, and then I had 2 techniques for gluing these in place. On this section I had a bit of prep work to do, sanding the wall flat, which I used my random orbit sander for, again attached to Henry to keep the dust down. I then pre-drilled the mitered corners to take lost tight screws and foamed up each section before gluing it in position, using wood glue and those screws on the corners. And the ruby suction cup was again handy to push the skirting tight against the back wall. This corner here is just trying to spring out a bit, so I'm going to sort that out now with this quick clamp. That's literally closed it up beautifully. You can see the PVA glue taking effect. And notice I still hadn't got the wall completely flat. There was a bit of a bulge here which needed clamping. So at risk of stating the obvious, get your walls as flat as you can because it's really hard to get the expanding foam good as it is to keep a skirting against the wall where you've had to clamp it in position, where you've forced it into place. Once I took these clamps off, it sprung back in this corner. I had to mechanically fix it with screws and then fill the holes. Around the fridge and bifolds I had a bit of scribing to do. This cutout was straightforward enough, but then I needed to use my old profiling gauge to copy the contours below the bifold and transfer this onto the skirting, which I then cut and chiselled away. A slightly crude but effective technique, making use of the tools that I had available. Then corner technique number 2, using miter bond glue to glue the external angles together. This stuff's a bit like super glue. You spray one side, apply glue to the other and hold them together for 10 seconds and you've got an instant bond. Well, in theory, it's not as easy as it looks, maybe because of the open structure of MDF end grains, I don't know, but it did need a couple of goes on this one to get it to bond. Can't say I'm a massive fan of this stuff. I much prefer PVA wood glue. But anyway, with that done, I can foam it up. You can see quite nicely in this time lapse how the foam expands and then press it into place. As you can see by now, I'm using less mechanical fixings, just 2 here to hold it in place whilst the foam's set, which brings us on to the final part of this video, a complete section, skirtings and architraves with no screws at all. I had a bit more scribing to do here, so I took the contour off a piece of paper, cut it out, and then copied that onto the skirting, and then used the coping saw to cut it out. By now I'd switched to the Instastick to see how that works. Personally, I think these were pretty similar in terms of performance. They certainly have similar internal cell structures. I'd also figured that clamping really isn't required unless the surfaces are uneven, because there's pretty much no expansion of the foam once you press the surfaces together. Then the left section of the architrave, followed by the horizontal top section, all again very straightforward. Pressed into place, held for a minute or two, and then that's it, it holds. But that's when things got a bit tricky. I'd already had to reset that small left-hand piece when it came off and I tried to get a glazing packer under it. And try as I might, I couldn't get the right-hand architrave to bond. The adhesive either disintegrated or disappeared, or just came off, leaving me having to scrape it off and start again. This happened 3 times until I finally got a good bond on the 4th. And I've since discovered a similar issue with one of the architraves in the kitchen that was done with the Everbuild adhesive. So what's going on here? Well, I discussed it with Sam, our resident foam guru, on my Discord channel. Perhaps not enough water on each surface. Did I shake the can enough? I think so. Or possibly having the gun on the smallest setting lets out too much solvent and not enough foam precursor. So I did a trial to see if water or lack of it was an issue, because if I'm honest, I did occasionally forget to wet the wall beforehand. The results of this were pretty inconclusive, other than getting me into even more trouble with DIY for creating more mess. Not helped by the plastering done by some builders back in 2010 having almost zero key onto the wall, but I guess you'd say the water section had bonded more tightly to the plaster, and you should always use water to assist with the curing process. The third piece demonstrated that it's important you let the foam go off for a few minutes. Instastick instructions say up to 5 before applying the foam, as if you don't, the foam is completely ineffective. Look at that, it's just falling off straight away. And if you look closely at it, the foam has completely disintegrated. Then there was this test. We've sped through about 20 minutes here. And you can really see the difference between the piece that cured with water and the one that didn't in terms of the internal cell structure. So I suppose the conclusion to make here is make sure you wet both surfaces before spraying. Spray on as much foam as you dare without it splurging out the sides, because that kitchen architrave definitely didn't have enough. Don't tell your other half if you're doing it on a new quartz worktop, and make sure you leave it for a good few minutes before pressing the 2 pieces together. So what conclusions can we draw from this? Well, it can be a tricky process to apply this stuff, but I think I've learned most of the pitfalls throughout this video, and I hope I've also passed them on to you so that you can do it seamlessly for your project. Bottom line, I'm pleased with the results, and I will be using this stuff for my next skirting and architrave job, because it's as easy, if not easier to use than grab adhesive, and you don't have the issue of the grab adhesive tube going off when you've finished using it. Keep the foam on the gun until you've finished it up. Also, the skirtings will be easier to remove should you need to do so by sliding a saw down the back, assuming of course you haven't had to use any screws. And on that point, if you have got warped boards or uneven surfaces, you're not going to be able to use expanding foam adhesive without screws. But then I guess that'll be the case if you use grab adhesive too. So that's it for today. I hope you found this video useful. Give it a thumbs up if you have, and let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. Don't forget, details of everything I've talked about will be in the description below the video, which of course you can access by clicking on the More button. And for anyone new to my channel, it would be a massive boost to have you subscribe. You can do that by clicking on the link here, and don't forget to click the bell notification icon so you get notified of all my future uploads. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.